Hi everyone, my name is Anna and I'm an English tutor here at Uplift. Today I'm going to be talking about texts and human experiences, which is the common module in advanced English, and we're going to be talking about 1984 by George Orwell. Now, 1984 has experienced a bit of a resurgence in popularity and relevance in recent years, so we're really going to be deconstructing the opening chapter today and focusing on how it really sets the framework for the exploration of a certain human experiences throughout the rest of the text. So to start us off, I've compiled a couple of focus questions that we're going to use as the kind of guiding logic behind the way that we analyze. And this is really important because generalized analysis is not your friend. You always have to keep in mind the rubric as you're considering your set text. And this is really important as we're coming up to the HSC and you're doing your revision work. So the focus questions that I've set up are going to help us make sure that we're staying focused and concentrated on relevant ideas within our analysis and ultimately be better prepared when it comes to approaching practice questions. So for the first question, what is the relationship between the construction of setting as part of narrative strategy and the representation of human experiences? So the rubric links that I've compiled there are basically the ideas regarding human qualities and emotions. And the second one is how language is used to shape representations. So an idea that we can all relate to and understand is that our environments play a big role in our emotions, our state of mind, and ultimately the human experiences that we go through. So that is true for obviously constructed textual worlds and works of fiction. So Orwell, in his construction of the setting of Oceania or the Golden Country, more specifically the urban squalor, right, of Airstrip 1, we really have to deconstruct how is he using that to filter the representation of certain human experiences. So that's going to be the first big idea that we focus on. Now, the second idea, how is Winston Smith represented as an anomaly within this constructed textual world? Now, anomaly, straight away, bells should be ringing. That's an important kind of key word from the rubric. Obviously, we have to explore how texts give insight into anomalies, paradoxes, and inconsistencies in human behavior and motivation. So Winston Smith, our protagonist, is an anomaly within this world because he is a political dissident who goes against the ideology of the Ingsoc regime. So that is going to be the second idea, and obviously that's more linked to characterization. So really what we're focusing on, the foundation of fiction writing, which is setting and characterization, and we're going to be focusing on that kind of dual-pronged approach. Now, the third idea, how does Orwell rely on tropes associated with the dystopian genre and conventions of literary modernism to construct his cautionary tale? So whenever you're analyzing, the mantra that you should keep in mind is to always focus on macro techniques. Don't focus on very isolated incidences of certain techniques. Make sure to focus on broader trends and tropes so that you're considering form-specific techniques and broadly understand the logic of the construction of the text. So those are things that we're going to be bringing up today within our consideration of chapter 1. Now, getting into chapter 1, we're going to be going line by line and kind of talking about some of the main techniques. So let's start off with the iconic opening line of 1984. It was a bright, cold day in April and the clocks were striking 13. Now, the reason why this line is so iconic is obviously due to the paradox at the core of that kind of idea. The clocks were striking 13. Now, there's two main ways to read this. The first option is to read this as an idiom. Now, an idiom is a popular societal saying or phrase, and the 13th stroke of the clock refers to this idea of unreliability. If we go back and we think kind of a regular analog clock, that obviously only goes up to 12 hours. So the 13th stroke of the clock innately implies something, again, suspicious, paradoxical. So 13th stroke of the clock as an idiom refers to the need to question everything that has kind of preceded that idea. So straight away, we're kind of thrust into this world of unreliability, of suspicion, of paradox. And I think this is a really good kind of opening line to set the tone for the rest of the narration of the text. Now, the second idea I've put there are the kind of military connotations associated with striking 13. Now, when we think about the analog clock, we can compare that to 24-hour time. Now, 13th stroke of the clock would be 1 p.m. So maybe there's this kind of rigidity and routine implied by the clock striking 13. And that would obviously align with the dystopian nature of this society. So those are kind of two options to look at. Now, if we go into the next line, Winston Smith, his chin nuzzled into his breast in an effort to escape the vile wind, slipped quickly through the glass doors of the Victory mansions, though not quickly enough to prevent a swirl of gritty dust from entering along with him. If we think of the name Winston Smith, a couple of things here. So obviously it is a deeply anglicized name, Winston Smith. I look at the symbolism behind this name because obviously nomenclature is also an important strategy of characterization, the idea that your name can imply certain traits. So Winston Smith, quite a average name, unremarkable in any way, I think really aligns with this idea of reading Winston as an everyman, someone that the audience is positioned to view this world through. So Winston plays a really important function due to the kind of third-person limited narration and the way that informs the structure of the text. So we're positioned to view this world through the eyes of Winston Smith, and even his name implies an everyman, an average Joe Blow, and in that sense, we're kind of, again, positioned to empathize with him a little bit. If we keep going, in an effort to escape the vile wind, later on we get the mention of a swirl of gritty dust entering along with him. I've labelled this as synesthesia. So the idea that we're combining different forms of sensory imagery in order to get a really rich picture of the setting that is being constructed. So if we think of swirl of gritty dust, you're getting kind of simultaneously this visual and tactile sensation, which informs our understanding of the setting. So there, again, we get this picture of urban squalor and quite an uninviting landscape, which again, we can link back to those ideas about the dystopian genre. Victory mansions, all throughout the text, you'll see the epithet victory associated with anything that is kind of rationed by the government. And again, we can see that linking to ideas of propaganda, you would tie that into the World War II context, which obviously informs the construction of this text. Okay, let's keep going. The hallway smelt of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. Again, very specific olfactory imagery contributing to that atmosphere of squalor. At one end of it, a coloured poster too large for indoor display had been tacked to the wall. It depicted simply an enormous face more than a metre wide, the face of a man about 45, with a heavy black moustache and ruggedly handsome features. Now, this coloured poster within this atmosphere of squalor, quite a, again, uninviting setting, we get this point of salience. I always picture it as this coloured poster. And obviously that motif, which we know represents Big Brother, there is this allusion being made to Joseph Stalin. So if we think of a man about 45, a heavy black moustache, this is obviously informed by, again, the World War II context, the rise of totalitarian leaders, and here, again, Stalin representing this kind of iconic figurehead of the Soviet regime, which is kind of borrowed to represent figurehead of Ingsoc, which is Big Brother. Winston made for the stairs. It was no use trying the lift. Again, this underlying irony within this futuristic dystopian world. There's no point trying the lift because the electricity doesn't work. So again, this strict sense of control, I think, permeates the text. Even at the best of times, it was seldom working, and at present, the electric current was cut off during daylight hours, part of the economy drive in preparation for Hate Week. Now, Orwell, in line with demands of the dystopian genre, comes up with these unique fictionalized constructs of the Ingsoc regime. So Hate Week as this ideologically driven celebration of hatred and animosity and antagonism as a way of riling up the people. So I think that's also important. Consider the creative elements that underlie this dystopian world, because those neologisms, for example, and these constructs are ultimately the base of this futuristic society. If we keep going, the flat was 7 flights up. Winston, who was 39 and had a varicose ulcer above his right ankle, went slowly, resting several times on the way. Now, if we think about this idea of a varicose ulcer, I've labeled that as a motif. Now, we see the varicose ulcer popping up quite a few times in the text, predominantly before Winston meets Julia. And the way that we consider it typically, symbolic for repression. And I think this dichotomy of unconscious and conscious, we usually read as an example of that kind of repression. On each landing opposite the lift shaft, the poster with the enormous face gazed from the wall. So what I've labelled it here is, even in this opening chapter, the poster is mentioned quite a few times. And how I've analysed it is that repetitiveness kind of positions the audience to empathise with Winston's position, the ubiquity of that propaganda and that sense of surveillance, which I think is really important. So really vicariously, we are positioned to be engaged in this world. It was one of those pictures which are so contrived that the eyes follow you about when you move. Big Brother is watching you, the caption beneath it ran. So an irony of this, obviously, is we have those kinds of fraternal connotations or ideas associated with the idea of a big brother, someone's going to look after you, but obviously it's more deeply sinister and insidious because there is that implication of constant paranoia and surveillance, which obviously is the hallmark of this inksock regime. So if we keep going, inside the flat, a fruity voice was reading out a list of figures. The voice came from an oblong metal plaque like a dulled mirror. Winston turned a switch and the voice sank somewhat, though the words were still distinguishable. The instrument was called the telescreen. Now, a neologism, a new word, right, that Orwell invents. There are many of them throughout the text. So doublethink as an iconic example of another one. These neologisms, again, provide a sense of realism to this futuristic dystopian world. And the telescreen, I think, is important because this sense of being watched doesn't stop at the door of Winston's apartment. There is no set concept of privacy, which I think is important. And there was no way of shutting it off completely. So that high modality, that sense of finality, there's no escape from this. There's a sense of futility to even wishing for any alternative. And then here we get a little bit of indirect characterization of Winston himself. He was a smallish, frail figure with a meager body. His skin was roughened up by coarse soap and blunt razor blades. So I think what's really interesting is Winston is not an old man. He's only 39, maybe not in his physical prime, but there is no need to represent him as being quite so frail and physically weak. So what's interesting, I think, is this irony, is this society professes itself to be so advanced, technologically innovative, but that those advancements ultimately only serve to maintain the status quo in terms of the balance of power, as opposed to actually benefiting its citizens. So a key value or idea that we need to think about is, who do governments work for? What is their underlying ethos? And I think that's something that's really played upon by Orwell. So if we keep going, outside the world looked cold, so perpetuation of those same ideas. Little eddies of wind were whirling dust and torn papers. There seemed to be no colour in anything apart from the posters. So again, reinforcing that squalor of that setting. And there I've listed, think about that in contrast with the Golden Country, which really is this idyllic natural setting. The black mustachioed faced gaze down, Big Brother is watching you. Again, those same phrases being repeated. And really, what he's reinforcing is, again, positioning his audience to be a little bit afraid and feel like they are under that surveillance as well. Another poster outside, flapping fitfully in the wind. There's a helicopter hovering for an instant like a blue bottle, snooping in people's windows, but only the thought police mattered. And what I've listed there, kind of most important idea, is that notice Orwell's laconic style, that he has a quite pared back style of writing. He's very direct and straight to the point. And I think that really ties into the cautionary style of his writing. There is a deeply political purpose to what he's talking about, and therefore it isn't quite as embellished a style of writing as you might find with other authors. Now, going back to our focus questions, what's the relationship between setting and the representation of human experiences? Setting is an externalization of your subjective state of mind. It colors your human experience. So if you find yourself in this squalid urban setting, we see those emotions and qualities informed by hatred, by isolation, by loneliness. How is Winston Smith represented as an anomaly? So it's third-person limited narration. We see this whole world through his eyes and his eyes only. Therefore, 1984, we get an insight into, again, his thoughts pertaining to his dissent and need for rebellion. How does Orwell rely on the trope with the dystopian genre and literary modernism? So obviously there is this deep focus on the subjectivity, the kind of psychological interiority of the protagonist in line with modernism. In terms of that dystopian genre, again, the futuristic setting, those neologisms to really form the foundation of this new world that he's forming. So those are the key ideas pertaining to chapter 1. Hopefully they help you kind of filter through some of those concepts into your consideration of the rest of your text. Best of luck for your HSC coming up. Thanks, everyone.